Hello and welcome to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. This is your host Greg Payne coming at you from Studio 12. This podcast is about being the best possible grandpa you can be, focusing on what it is to be a grandpa and how we can all share that experience together for our grandchildren. This evening's guest is Russell Wynne. Russell is currently the IT director at IPC, which is a nonprofit organization that brings electronic manufacturers, designers together, building a consortium to get people with standards and best practices implemented across the electronics industry. Russell is also active with Cowboy Action Shooting and is volunteering in a number of capacities within his church as well as within his local community. And Russell, thank you so much for joining us and talking with us this evening about the impact that your grandfathers have had on you.
Thanks for having me, Greg. This is actually, when I heard you were doing it, I kind of poked you and said, I kind of wanted to do it. You know, they had a big influence on my life, so I'm kind of excited about it. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and one of the things that we're doing is obviously talking to grandpas about being a grandpa, but then I also want to talk to people about what the influences of their grandparents and grandpas in particular have been on their lives. It's one thing, of course, to remember that influence when we're in our teens and 20s, but as we get older, that influence is still with us. And, a number of stories that you shared around a campfire with me just really piqued my interest and thought it would be a great idea to have you share those. So if you wouldn't mind, maybe introduce your grandpas and give us a little bit of background, what they were and how similar and how dissimilar they both were too.
Sure. Yeah, they really were, they were similarities, but there were also very, very different people and hugely different backgrounds. On one side, so I'll just identify them both. I have Grandpa Barry, that'd be my mother's father, and Daddy Floyd was my father's father. So, on those two sides, my Daddy Floyd was an Oklahoma farmer. And his father was an Oklahoma farmer, and his father was an Oklahoma farmer, and his father was a Texas farmer, and his father was a Missouri farmer. So, the generations and generations of farmers. And, so not what I would call wealthy, but he was a successful farmer. I remember, growing up, him having hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of acres of wheat that he was farming, or maize, and he ran cattle as well. So, very active in that.
Oh, wow.
So that's on one side. On the other is Grandpa Barry. He's also from Oklahoma, but he was an oil company president for 50 years. His father started the company. That company is still around today and still provides for probably 60 families, 60, 70 families. That's their primary income. So the influence and they were very different men, I guess, is
Sure.
what I would say. Very, very different backgrounds.
Sure. Now, one of the things that I think we were talking about was a little bit about the business lessons that you started learning with, I believe, Grandpa Barry. You had an interesting story about how he would let negotiations go and just walk somebody back through to some of the inconsistencies he had versus, I know, not to talk bad about those folks from the Northeast, but Northeast can get very loud.
There. I know, yeah, it's challenging sometimes.
Yeah, it's very loud, very abrupt sometimes, but it's interesting how the story you had about your grandfather just walking somebody back through and catching some inconsistencies.
Yeah, so it was very interesting. So I was in my early 20s, and I was doing some work for him. He had hired me, and he was a wonderful coach for me professionally, and particularly early in my career. But he still has an influence on me today. The instance you're really referring to is he owned and managed a piece of property in Oklahoma that was some developers were wanting to put an Albertsons and a Kmart. It was a strip mall, but it had some key anchor stores that
Sure.
that were going to be part of it. And the developer that was really working on it, and I shouldn't say that the promoter, he wasn't necessarily the developer, but the promoter that was really trying to put this together and get it really sold, kind of slimy, quite frankly. And listening to my grandfather, he was one of the kindest, gentlest men I have ever met. And I never heard him yell. I never heard him swear. I never heard him say an unkind word, really, which is kind of phenomenal as a person. But we're sitting in this meeting, and I'm listening to it, and I'm completely amazed at the way my grandfather's leading this meeting, because he's pulling some points out of the guy, and then we talk a little bit more, and he'll pull another couple points for him about it. And he pulls him around to the end, and he says, now let's see, we've got point A and we've got point B, and it's obvious those are headed in opposite directions, and that the guy's lying somewhere.
Hmm.
And to watch and listen to this guy backpedal without him ever saying anything unkind, anything sharp. He was really, really sharp. So I was grateful for the coaching and influence that he gave, particularly in how to lead some of those things. He was phenomenal.
Yeah. Now, how do you think that helped you out in your 20s and going into your 30s as you started your career? Because that's certainly one approach, like we talked about. A lot of people in Northeast have a very different approach, but it seems like that really sunk in as far as a strategy. Um, Obviously, time and place for different tools, but
That's right. And he gave me a number of good tools, as you say. Between him and my father, some wonderful tools for negotiation and for you know bartering and dickering. And the number of zeros at the end of the price really don't matter. The game is the same. And so, as we look at the things that he taught me and the way those worked, uh, I have used those same skills in you know everything from buying a car to buying or selling a house to doing. I did a contract a couple months ago for $1.5 million.
hmm.
That influences every single one of those.
Yeah, and and not everybody gets that chance to sit down and watch grandfathers or even their fathers in that work environment. So that had to have been just one of many lessons that you got from your grandfather in that respect.
Absolutely, absolutely. There was, it was one of those funny things with that grandfather, with Grandpa Barry. When I was about 5 years old, is when we really started to get close. And so when I was about five, I started going over to their house every Friday night. And I was always excited about it because where I lived, we didn't really have much of a TV, but he had cable. And so I could go over there, and I'd had like three different channels I could watch cartoons on. It was amazing on Saturday morning. So I'd go over on Friday, and we, about dinner time, and so we'd sit down, and dinner was always interesting because if Grandma cooked, who knows what you'd have. If he cooked, it would always be he'd spent time in Hawaii. It would always be something Chinese or something Japanese or something Asian, and sometimes it was good, sometimes it wasn't, but
Sure.
it was always interesting. So it kind of opened my eyes and my palate up a little bit. But then at night we would typically we'd play chess. He taught me to play chess very early. I think we started playing chess when I was about 7, and I think I was 14 before I beat him.
Oh
So
wow.
he was not gentle.
Sure.
He was kind about it, but he told me at one point when I was upset because I'd gotten close to winning and hadn't won, and he said, "Well, I'm not going to let you in. That'd give you it's not an accomplishment then."
Right. Right.
And so, boy, it just that was hard. But I finally did beat him. I finally got to where I could match wits with him on the chess table. But we also did woodworking together. And we'd go down to, he had two shops. One was a larger project workshop with the big saws and and all of the big power tools. And then in his basement, he had a smaller workshop. But now that I'm approaching having some of those same things myself, I realized, oh, he had a finishing shop in his basement. And we'd go down to his finishing shop. He always had something for me to work on. He'd work on his project. Occasionally he'd let me work on it with him, but usually he had something else for me to work on. And he never took it over from me, never did it for me,
Okay.
but always had, was there to answer a question or there to point something out. And that was true when we hit business later. Sorry, I didn't mean to drag out the answer to that,
Oh no.
but it was kind of throughout. It didn't start when I was 18 or 20 or 25. It started when I was 5. um, and I can remember, fairly early on, he worked a block away from the house. I can remember falling over to the office and being there for a couple of hours, and he said, "Hey, if you'll come with me and just hang out while I do a couple of these things," he said, "maybe we'll go down to he had a what do you call it? A developed film. So he had a dark room. There we go.
Oh,
He had a
okay.
dark room, and so we go down and he taught me to develop film, and so lots of great experiences between everything from woodworking and stamp collecting, and I spent a lot of time with him, and he had a huge influence on me. But just his approach to life, and how thoughtful and how intentional a lot of the things he did were. And then particularly appreciated that more as an adult, realizing uh, some of the influences he had on me were also intentional. They were intended to train me.
Sure. Okay. Well,
I love
that,
them,
yeah, that,
but
and I was going to ask you about that is if you get this sense looking back how intentional he was with some of those lessons. I mean, definitely, it sounds like the chess that was definitely. I'm not going to give it to you. You got to earn
yeah,
the win and build up the skill set. But then also too, probably some of the things in the shop, he probably let you fail on a few items.
I messed
You
up
know,
more wood. you know, most of what I made wasn't worth even, putting on a shelf to go, what I made that? No, 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 it was junk when I got done with it, even as a kid. But as I look at what was he trying to teach me, the intentionality of what he did, he taught me patience. As I'm working on something, think it through, plan it, think about how it's, if it was building something, it was how's it going to fit together? How, when this goes on, how are you going to slide this through? What's the
right?
order you need to assemble in? And so he taught me a lot of very intentional, being intentional with how I approach problems.
Yeah, and I
And
think I'm sorry, I was
no, you're good.
just going to jump in. It sounds like that's also with chess, right? I think probably
Same
there's
thing.
there's a crossover of chess and life.
Almost every
How many
the
steps
photography and the
ahead? How
development,
many?
it was
Yeah,
thinking ahead, because you had to time it. You had to know you had to know. All right, it's this kind. It sits in this fluid for that long. Sits in, it gets exposed for this long. Under the projector, and it was all about thinking the process through. Almost everything we did, there was, was think the process through.
and there was um, there was the possibility of failure with the projects. I mean, none
Oh
of
yeah,
these things were life or death, but they were definitely, to your point, there's a lot of messed up wood in the back corner of the shop.
yeah. I still do it. I messed up one last week.
You know, but I think too is that it becomes natural for grandparents to want to jump in and correct. I mean, even as parents, sometimes we
We
want to
hate to
jump
see
in.
people fail.
Yep.
We care so much about our kids, and yet so my kids, my grandkids, the thing that I look at both of my grandfathers and think about them is, man, I've got big shoes to fill.
Mm,
If I look at the influence they were on me, and we're focused on grandparents, but I had a lot of influences. My grandparents, my parents, my father had a big part of some of those too. And I'm pretty sure both my grandparents asked my parents what I needed to learn.
right. Well, and
I get that feeling,
yeah,
because there was definitely a concerted effort in a few places.
and we brought that up with a few of the people on the podcast so far is that this idea that grandpas can be a really good source to work something out with the grandchildren. It's a different
Mhm.
voice, it's a different approach. The relationship dynamics are a little bit different, and so asking grandpas to step in and work with somebody through a growing experience can be
Absolutely.
very beneficial.
Well, and I used my father the same way with one of my sons. Well, actually, with both of my sons.
Sure.
So I sent both of them out to him. Here, fix this.
Yeah, yeah.
It wasn't quite that. It wasn't
Right,
that
right,
blunt,
right.
but just in talking, he said, "Well, send them out. We'll work on that."
Yeah.
Type thing. And so yeah, I've got some big shoes to fill.
Oh, absolutely. It sounds like there's a lot of lessons there. Now, you were talking about that Daddy Floyd, very
Mhm.
different being the cattle rancher and farmer and raising lots of crops. And I think you had a lot of different experiences out on that farm you know, with him.
Yep. He lived farther away, but every summer starting when I was about 7, I would go spend between 2 and 6 weeks out in Oklahoma,
Okay.
staying with my grandmother and grandfather, with Daddy Floyd and Mima. And as I was younger, it was more time with Mima. But as I got a little bit older, it was really time with Daddy Floyd, and just his style of teaching was so different than Grandpa Barry.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very different in his approach, but also just as deliberate. As I grew, he'd give me stuff to do, and it was always for me a game at first. As an example, when I was 7 years old, I was there for wheat harvest, ostensibly to help.
Okay.
As an adult looking back, I'm not much help as a 7-year-old,
Yeah.
but that's what I was there for. And so one of my first jobs was to run parts. They had, and that was something that it's a legitimate thing to do, so it wasn't completely useless. Um, because we had let's see, one, two, three, four, about 5 or 6 combines running at one time,
Oh, wow.
usually in 2 different locations.
Yeah.
With those combines, you've got a half dozen trucks running also,
Yep.
and stuff breaks. I'm sorry, stuff broke every day.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't just run flawlessly all the time. And so my job would be, you know, I'm running between, the 2 fields and, the house and the shop and, and sometimes the town.
Okay.
They gave me an El Camino. Eddie Floyd put me in an El Camino. And that leads to another story we'll probably tell here in a minute, but talking
Yeah.
about how intentional and deliberate his approach was. But so I had this El Camino. I would run, stuff around. So I'd be given the errand. Here you go. Go run this over to, to Brian and Kevin over in whatever field. They got a, broken combine, and or here, here's lunch for that crew. Go run it out to them. And at 7 years old to be given a vehicle and tell go.
Oh, yeah.
That was
What?
awesome.
Well, that was I was gonna ask you, knowing I've spent time on farms and things myself. Was how old were you when you got the keys to the El Camino?
7.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the first solo driving experience I had was those 3-wheeled tractors. Well, it's 2-wheeled in the front, but they're right together.
Right. Yep.
Yeah, one of those. Not a
Okay.
terribly big. It seemed big when I was 5. It was massive when I was 5.
Yeah.
My dad had put me to work plowing this little field out behind the barn.
Mm-hmm.
And when I say out behind the barn, it's like 50 yards from the barn. That didn't help. So there was so I'm working out there and I'm back and forth, with this little, it was just a little harrow. It wasn't even anything interesting,
Sure.
it's just, just raking that plot back there. And I don't know that he ever planted anything in it. It was just, again, teaching. But yeah, I ran that tractor through a chicken coop.
Yeah.
So, in one side, out the other.
I
Anyway,
wouldn't.
sorry, that's my dad, not the others. But
Yeah. Yeah.
that was the first driving. Yeah, Daddy Floyd handed me the keys to the El Camino when I was 7.
Okay. Okay.
And I felt like I was going fast. Looking back, I probably never got above 25 miles an hour in that thing.
Right. Yeah.
Anyway.
But that's such a different world. I think when we grew up, because I was doing some of the similar things on my grandfather's farm, wheat farm in Eastern Oregon. Same type of tractors, the two right close to each other in the back or in the front. Doing some disking, accidentally hitting trees and knocking some limbs off. Trying to figure out the turn radius on those things when you don't drive them all the time it can.
And if you don't realize when you're not heavy enough to stand on one of the rear wheel brakes to spin it,
yeah,
I could jump on it all day when I was 7 or 8, and it wouldn't even budge.
Mm-hmm. No, interesting experience. Now some of the things that we definitely talk about was the crossover between, I think, the confidence levels and some of the lessons that they both gave you, even though they were coming at it in different directions.
Yeah.
You want to talk a little bit about, not just what they were instilling with you, but even what they were trying to help you develop into, the young man and then the man that, that you've become.
I would say both of them were very focused on a couple of things combined. As in they were focused on the same things. And one was teaching me to think. They constantly threw problems at me. Here, go figure this out. And they're working on something here. What do you think we should do with it? I distinctly remember both of them asking me that question. They're working on, hey, what should we do with this? Whatever it was, building something, fixing something, tearing something down. Make me think about it. So one of them was make me think, and then a lot of times I'd think it through. They might give some ideas and suggestions, but if what I said would work, they'd do it that way. They would follow through and say, all right, well, let's go do it. And and so you look at it that way, and that, and then instilling some confidence in that ability to solve a problem.
Yeah.
How often do people fail because of inaction? How often do people fail because they can't make a decision?
No,
You know, they,
all the
all the
time.
time. And and the fact that that was a specific area that both of my grandfathers focused on with me, I is incredible and has made such a difference. My daddy Floyd had such a way of working with people, and in particularly his family. He's got a crew of, he had four boys. Those four boys had boys, all of them. you know,
Hmm.
in my generation, there's only two girls, and that weren't married in. And then out of our kids, there's a half dozen.
Okay.
So it's tons and tons and tons of boys. Well, for Mima's 100th birthday, so just a couple years ago, we got together out in Oklahoma. All of us, we said, let's do a family reunion. The Winds don't do family reunions. We did one.
Sure.
And so it was amazing. Some of these, some of the folks, seeing them all together, I hadn't seen them all together since I was a kid. And so a great opportunity to stand around and talk. But we all showed up, and one of my uncles walked in and said, "Hey, that big water tank out in the back pasture? There was a water tank that was probably 18 feet in diameter and 25 feet long.
Wow.
So it's not little,
Right.
laying on its side out in the field, been there for 10 years."
Hmm.
He said, "I got a place for that and we need to move it. Would you guys help me put it on a trailer?" Okay, we all walked out. He drove the trailer out. We didn't have a backup. We didn't know power tools. It was 10 guys with ropes and chains.
Oh wow.
And the funniest thing is, as that thing got anchored down we got it on the trailer. I realized as we got it on the trailer, none of us talked about how we were going to put it on that trailer. Not a word.
Huh.
We all got out, got in our places, and put it on the trailer. And the only comments I remembered, I mean, we all were talking, life, what's going on? How's your, hey, I
Right.
haven't heard from so and so. How are they doing? That kind of conversation. And the only things I remember about the work we were doing is chain coming over. Somebody was throwing a chain over, and we're supposed to look up. It didn't pause the conversation, but it was that type of thing, And when there were six guys on one of them, when somebody said pull, we all pulled. That wasn't, the conversation never stopped. There was no discussion of how we were going to do it.
Wow.
He had
Just
trained all of us to work.
yeah, and everybody kind of knew their place and what needed to be done
Well,
as well.
yes, and any of us could have taken any of the other spots. It really is. I'm standing here. This is my place.
Sure.
I will do this part. And the only direction we really had was that my uncle Denny was he's 88, I think now. So yeah, so he was in his 80s at the time. He's standing in the back of the pickup going, "Yeah, a little more to the right." Just move it over so it's in the center of the trailer. That's about as much direction that we had as a crew. But yeah, other than somebody was, I can't even remember who told us to pull and lift, and but it wasn't the same person every time.
Yeah. Yeah. Just
So yeah, it was just, I remember getting done with that, and as we're walking back up to the house, and that was such a tribute to my grandfather, to me. It just blew me away that 10 12 of us could get together like that, work for 45 minutes, get the job done with, it was pretty efficient,
yeah.
and never talk about it. We all had been given the same training. So
Hmm.
that was like, wow, we really are the product of the same person.
Right. Oh, that must have been huge. Well, you're saying it is, but I mean, even just thinking back about it, where okay, everybody had their own experiences with your grandpa, and
Hmm.
everybody had very similar experiences to the point where years later, you guys, to like you said, just could walk out into the field, flip this thing up, get it up onto the trailer, and go without hardly any coordination. You didn't need 45 minutes to talk about, well, maybe we should do it this way, maybe we should do it that way. It was just, here's the problem.
It
Everybody
was
gets,
family getting the job done. It
yeah.
was, yeah. So anyway, it wasn't a planned story for today, but it was a good illustration of the kind of thoughtful training he gave his kids. And when he passed away, there were several hundred people showed up to his funeral.
Hmm.
And for a guy who had been paralyzed from a stroke 10 years before, been bedridden, nobody'd seen him for 10 years, and to have that many people show up to his funeral, he had that kind of an impact on the whole community.
Yeah. Wow.
So, he was an incredible man. But yeah, very deliberate. It, kind of crude's not, he was not crude. Uh, Different approach to training boys. He let us be boys. He didn't tell us not to do stuff. When we did something stupid, he'd go, "Well, did you learn anything?" Yeah, it hurts when I jump off the board. Yeah, you can do it again. Not without something soft under me.
Right.
He'd
Right.
go, "Fair enough." It wasn't like, "Well, don't do it again." It's like, well, he was always just, "What'd you learn?"
Yeah. Well,
And
and that's a huge learning experience, I think, for other grandpas and people out there is, one, let the kids think the problem out, get their input on it. And if it's not a critical mistake in the makings, go ahead and execute on what the kid, grandson, granddaughter is thinking about, because
yeah,
that's their opportunity to start to lead a little bit and start to get that confidence in making a decision. I think to our earlier point where we see so many people with inaction not wanting to make a decision is because they've never been given opportunities to do so, or at least not enough opportunities to go, if I make the wrong decision and it doesn't work out great, okay, we've got to do something else. It's almost
right.
like, okay, push them aside in their younger years. Somebody else makes the decision, then they execute, and then when it's time to
Yeah,
get out on their own, they don't know what to do, or it's almost analysis by paralysis to an extent,
yeah.
because then you start thinking of all the variables, and you don't have that grandfather sitting there going, okay, it's been 3 minutes, what's your plan? You know?
Right. Well, and I was, as you were talking, I really got the thought very clearly from both of my memories of both my grandfathers. They taught us how to fail, and that's a terrible thing to say, but there's life after failure.
Yeah.
Failure doesn't mean you're done. Failure doesn't mean you'll never succeed. Failure doesn't mean you've lost. You just found one way that doesn't work,
Right. Yep.
and try another. And so I look at those. They allowed a lot of controlled failure, I think is what I would call it. Failure within bounds. The failures that I made, very rarely did I get hurt. I mean, I didn't break any bones. I did have a lot of
Sure.
stitches, lots of bruises, but no serious injuries. Um, so it was one of those things where, I, talking about driving with El Camino, to give you an idea of controlled failure, he handed me keys. I did not know. Well, let me back up. Tell two stories to make the point. Story number one is when I would go down there to Oklahoma and join my grandfather for that, those few weeks every year. He would wake up before dawn every morning, and he would go down to the Swinging J Cafe, a couple miles from the house, and he'd have his cup of coffee, and he'd have a biscuit and sausage, which, by the way, is still one of my favorite
Mm-hmm.
breakfasts. Um, he'd do that, and he wouldn't wake me up. If I was up, he'd take me. If I wasn't, I didn't go. And man, I hated missing that. We'd go down and we'd sit around this table with his friends, so adults at the time, other grandpas, and they'd chat about cows and fields and storms and birds that were eating crops and whatever it might be for 30 minutes, an hour maybe. And then we'd go back to the house and start the day. I love that. Well, so that leads, I'll come back to that story in a minute. So he gives me the keys to this El Camino and gives me errands to run. So I was doing that. It turns out years later, I mean, in my 40s, I was in Oklahoma again visiting, and we went back to the Swingin' J was gone. They'd picked a new spot to meet. So I was sitting with my grandfather and a couple others. Well, turns out one of the guys at the table was one of the sheriff's deputies from then. And he had been sitting around the table when I was there, and he'd introduced me. He says, "Oh, you're Lee's boy." Like, yeah. He goes, "I remember when you'd come in here and your grandfather introduced you, and he said, if you see a towhead in a El Camino drive by, that's my grandson. Let me know if he does anything stupid. And here's the errands I'm going to give him." He would tell him where I was
Right.
going,
Right.
and come to find out, and so he told me that one, the sheriff already knew who I was and where I was supposed to be going, but two, he usually followed me at about a quarter to a half mile.
Okay.
My grandfather did. So he'd follow me, make sure I didn't drive into a ditch, or not that I didn't. Sorry, he made sure he was going to be there to help pull me out
Right.
when I screwed up. And just I never knew that. I had no idea.
Yeah.
I didn't know he was following me. I didn't know the sheriff knew. I didn't know. And the sheriff was laughing. He says, "Yeah, I knew it was you." He says, "Because this El Camino to go by with nobody driving." Because I can remember when I was that age, I'm literally was sitting on the seat as high as I could get my head, and I was looking under the steering wheel and above the dash. That's
Yep.
how I was driving. So
Oh,
that was
wow.
not big. Sorry, but that again,
Yeah.
intentional, not setting me up to fail, but setting me up to that if I did, it wasn't a disaster.
Right.
And I do remember him telling me, first, keep it in first gear, keep it in second gear or below type thing. And by the time I was 8, here's the keys. You know
Yeah.
what you
You
need
know
to
what
do.
you do. Yeah.
Yeah, he was no longer worried about. I wasn't driving fast anyway, so
Yeah.
that
Now,
happened later.
now, but how did that experience make you feel when you went back home and you were talking to your other buddies and you got to tell them that you were driving around in an El Camino and you were
Oh, I
running?
don't believe you, one, and but two, it just I don't know. My relationships with my friends was different, I think, than a lot of kids, just because I could do stuff. I knew how to do things, and it's still kind of that way. I mean, I run into people who know how to do. You're one of those people who know how to do things, and there's a lot of people who don't.
Hmm.
They know one thing. They know what they do for their career, or they what they do for a hobby. They can't think their way out of a box.
Yeah, but you know, I think too though is giving your grandson granddaughter an experience like that has got to be, especially when they come, like what we were doing is going to our grandparents for the summer or going for spring breaks or whatever. Having that unique experience and being able to go back and even talk to your buddies and go, "Oh, I did this."
Yeah.
Is kind of huge because I had some of those experiences at my grandfather's farm too. I mean, I was able to start doing irrigation pipes, and eventually I got to the point where I could do 2 pipes at a time, running them
Yep.
through the irrigation, getting the siphon going, and then dropping the pipes into the rows to
Yep.
get the wheat.
There's an art to that.
Yeah, and it took a long time, but eventually, now none of my friends really cared that much because that wasn't the same as jumping a bike off of a ramp or something else. But
Yeah, but if you can do that in 2 shakes, that actually is pretty impressive. When somebody else tries to do it, they realize that's hard.
yeah, yeah. But it's giving those experiences and having those experiences. One, like you said, you're learning a lot of self confidence. You're feeling definitely part of the family and part of getting these things done. I mean, 5 big combines on the property is a big deal. Plus all the trucks that are running beside it catching all the wheat. And then, so you're part of that operation, and then you're doing stuff that normal 7-year-olds don't really do. I mean,
Yeah.
not a lot
Well,
of,
and he worked us through. He worked us through the entire. When you talk about learning to farm, I've done it all. Do I want to do it again? No, I don't. You notice I'm not a farmer for a career.
that's why we're in IT.
That's right. There's a good reason I'm in IT. It's because I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
But it's yeah. Growing up, I did the whole. Yeah, I drove the parts truck, and then next they put me in. Next they put me in the tractor doing the plowing and the disking and that, and then they put me in the combine, and then they put me in the trucks, and so the last way the trucks you didn't want to drive until you almost had a license. I had to be big enough the cops could see me because I had to drive it to Oklahoma City to dump it. So
Right.
anyway, yeah.
So, did you ever have? And this is definitely a curveball. But did you ever have an experience where maybe you had let down one of your grandparents or grandfathers? They told you, I don't know, I'm making this up. Go get the cows, bring them in, make sure the pen's locked up. Um,
you know um Kinda with Grandpa Barry, not as much. I mean, I broke some things unintentionally.
sure.
Where that was definitely a disappointment. When you break a tool, that's not a good thing. And so we talked about, yeah, you're stronger than you think. You're growing. You got to start now. You got to start being a little more careful. but never got mad at me for it. Daddy Floyd, yeah, there were some things there. I definitely drove a tractor through a few things, and sucked stuff up into a combine, all that good stuff. Where is that a disappointment? Yeah, he never chewed one of us out for it.
Okay.
Now, if we did it a second time, he'd ask us, "So how's this different from the first time, and why didn't you learn it the first time?" It was one of those, how are we going to avoid this? There was always that, call it a post-mortem in our IT world,
Right.
or an after action if you're military. It's like, all right, this happened. What are you going to do to make sure we don't do that again?
Yeah.
He was really good about that. And not that he didn't get angry, but he was never abusive, and it was never directed at us. It was always, all right, what are we going to learn from this?
Yeah.
How are you going to not do that again?
Well, and I also think, I mean, that example ties in well with some of the discussions that I've had previously, where as grandparents, even when you're around the kids for 6 weeks, 8 weeks at a time, the amount of time that you have with them is so short and so, lack of a better word, intense, that really making sure that you watch what you say and how you say it becomes important, because you can crush a grandchild so much more easily than a parent can. Not that a parent can't, but the kids are there every day most of the time. They know when mom's having a bad day or a bad couple of days. They know when dad's having a bad couple of days. Grandpa losing their cool a little bit.
Well, when people say, words have power,
Mm-hmm.
when it comes right down to it, words have power. And one of my mentors from years ago said, "There's black and white magic. Words words are magical, and they're either black or white. White magic is the ones that have a positive impact. White magic are the ones that get things done. White magic is the ones that help you communicate and help you improve the world around you. Black magic is when you tear apart relationships. Black magic is when you tear people down or destroy something. And unfortunately, the relationship between a grandparent and a grandchild, or even a parent and a child, those relationships are tender. And and we've all made, as a parent, I've made those mistakes.
Yep.
Hopefully, I'm a little better at it now than I used to be. No guarantee. Um, I'm definitely more conscious of it than I used to be, and hopefully, I can be conscious of that with my granddaughters, and and hopefully other grandkids, to come, and that I can, keep those relationships special, and be able to be that influence, but also really enjoy this. I'm sorry. There's something really cool about being a grandpa, being able to wind them up, shake them up, and back.
Yep. Yeah.
I get to buy them the toys with batteries that make noise.
Right. Yeah.
So, there is the evil grandpa side of me too, where it's like, yeah, there's a little bit of payback coming in here for my kids. But at the same time, those relationships really are special.
Yeah.
And to be careful of them.
Yeah, and that's just so important, because we definitely need to be mindful of that we don't often get the chance to have that quantity of time to help reverse something that may have, we could have spent weeks and weeks and years in building somebody up, but one bad experience can wipe all that out. And
yeah, it's very true.
there's definitely, you've got to be walking that line of, you want to make sure that everybody's safe, everybody knows what's going on. Sometimes you have to get somebody's attention, but at the same time, you have to be careful on how you do that. And it sounds like your grandpa's walked that line pretty well.
Yeah, I remember being afraid when I would break something, or being afraid when I'd do something. I don't know that I ever remember doing something seriously wrong. I was as their grandson, man, I wanted to please my grandpas.
Mm-hmm.
The last thing I wanted to do was something that wouldn't please them. So, there was, they had definitely built that kind of relationship with me. So huge amount of power over me that way, huge influence. But yeah, it was just, but they never tore me down for making a mistake. Um, in fact, it was usually, it was a learning opportunity or teaching opportunity.
Sure.
Not that I knew that at the time.
Yeah, well, and that's where grandpas can be sneaky that way. We can slip learning experiences in.
And both of them did that between, with one grandfather, it was woodworking and, furniture finishing and things like, chess, stamp collecting. And then as a young adult, oil interests and business skills. And then on the other side of that, I've got the other grandpa, which, taught me about farming. And not that I learned how to farm. I would never be a good farmer, but he taught me where those joys were. He taught me how to think. He taught me how to solve some of those, problems. He taught me to enjoy shooting turtles in the pond, which for anybody listening to this that doesn't understand that, turtles eat catfish. Grandpa Daddy Floyd liked catfish.
Yeah.
So those turtles were the enemy. Anyway.
Well,
great memories.
We've been talking for a little while, and I don't want to keep you too much longer, but if there's a particular story about either grandfather that you would like to leave us with, that would be great to hear that as we wrap this up.
Sure. I think both of them have wonderful stories. Some of them extremely funny. I think one that would give some that I find humorous and that I think gives some great insight into my Daddy Floyd is I was 8 or 9 years old, and we're driving along in his old pickup, and in the front seat are myself and my two oldest cousins. And so they were, probably 10 and 12, something like that. And the two of them, so we're lined up, Daddy Floyd, me, and then the two of them on the outside. And they started a fist fight in the cab of this pickup. And these two knew how to fight. There's some other good stories around that, but they like to fight.
Okay.
Daddy Floyd didn't say a word. He just kind of looked over at him, and I'm squished up against him as far as I can get to stay out of this fist fight because, that hurts. Anyway, he just pulls over to the side of this dirt road, gets out. They didn't stop. He walks around to the other side of the pickup, opens the door, reaches in, drags him out into the ditch. They look at him, and he goes, "Well, go on, finish what you started." Tell him to stop fighting. In fact, so they went back at it. They fought for another 3 or 4 minutes until they'd finally were breathing hard and dirty and bruised
Right.
and bloody lipped. And you done? Yeah. Get in the truck. Let's go.
Yeah.
Was it going to hurt anything? Could they hurt each other? Really? Not really.
Yeah.
Are they going to bruise? Sure. They solved their own problem, though.
Yeah, you got to work it out sometimes.
It's like, he's like, I'm not solving this for you. You guys got to figure this out. Anyway.
Oh, boy. Well, Russell, I really do appreciate you spending some time and sharing your experiences with your grandfathers. I think it just keeps going to prove that, what a valuable experience it is to have great grandfathers in grandchildren's lives and the impact that they have, and which lasts longer than just the teen years and in the 20s. But, here we are in our 50s, and, we're still thinking back about our grandfathers, the lessons that they've provided for us, and the examples that we're still trying to live up to, and those lessons that we're trying to pass on to our own grandchildren. So thank you so much for being a part of this.
Thanks for having me. It was fun to reminisce, and I appreciate the chance to share a little bit about my grandfathers.
Not a problem. And hang on while I'll say goodbye off air. Thank you for listening to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do me a favor and share it with a friend. That's the best way you can help us to expand our community, as well as get the news out about how valuable grandpas are in the lives of those kids. If you'd like to leave me a comment or shoot me a potential topic for this podcast, please go to www.cool-grandpa.us. Look for the comments tab, fill it out, hit submit. It's as easy as that. Until next time, remember to stay cool.